sort of at those, and you guys will, I think, probably have read this, those Pakistani leftists, those liberals who have argued that the war in the Northwest has been a progressive phenomenon. We have quite a few of those. So the first point, the Pakistan military has been integral to the networks of patronage that have built the ideological and material infrastructure for militancy in the region. This is something that that I think we know quite well from the 80s. And so, quite rationally and clearly from its perspective, this doctrine of strategic death, basically the Pakistani military is terrified that the Indians will gain a foothold in Afghanistan, because this means that they're cornered from both sides. So rationally from their perspective, they're in league with elements of the Afghan Taliban. There have been some important developments on this front, some sort of complicating developments perhaps, with the arrest of 7 of the 15 members of the Quetta Shura a few weeks ago. But in my opinion, this is not a sign that they are turning on erstwhile allies or anything like this. Rather, for me, what I see is that the worry for the army was quite simply that it was being left out of negotiations that seem to be underway in Afghanistan. So the last thing that they can afford is being excluded from a settlement in the country. So they played their hand. Beyond this, the basic contours of this relationship haven't changed. Even in the case of the different groups that make up the Pakistani Taliban, which is a distinct set of insurgencies, partly related, yes, but they came together, I think, in about December 2007, and they were calling for a redirection of the Taliban's focus to the Pakistani state for its collaborative role and things like this. So even in the case of the different groups that make up the Pakistani Taliban, the opposition of the Pakistani state has actually been quite inconsistent over time and place. I have a list here of about 6 or 7 inconsistently opposed commanders that the Pakistani Taliban, the Pakistani state has alternatively worked with and not worked with, continues to work with, signed peace deals with. So in sum, the establishment, the Pakistani state, has always seen this ideology in these groups as an asset, fundamentally. You see this in Afghanistan, and you see this in the case, again, of these individual groups within the Pakistani Taliban. So it can afford to dispose of some, I agree, and it can afford to fight some, even, when they stray from the party program, when they stray from the Pakistani state's strategic interests. But to suggest, as for example Parvez Hoodboy and some other friends do, that this means that finally the army can be trusted, to me demonstrates frightening political immaturity and frightening ignorance of the situation. The second point, this is another point that relates to the liberal argument about the Pakistani state. The Taliban, in many narratives, have come to stand in for the Talibanization of Pakistani society. So you have people talking about, for example, the rise of religious conservatism, the Saudiization, the Wahhabization of the Pakistani education system, intolerance of religious and cultural minorities, ethnic minorities, the thinning out of national culture. This, all I agree, is a central problem for progressives in the country. But I would argue that these are sociologically distinct and therefore politically distinct problems from the insurgencies in the Northwest. Again, they're pro-war leftists who have invoked the specter of religious bigotry at large in the country to mobilize support for the state's offensives in the Northwest. The thrust of, again, Hoodboy's apocalyptic arguments is this ominous connection between the silent, note-taking, veiled students that he teaches in Islamabad and the depredations of the Taliban in Swat. This is absolutely absurd. At a feminist event in Karachi, I remember hearing a young activist screech about how Karachi used to have discos, and now there are no discos, and the implication of this was, hence we must have war. I mean, this is outrageous, right? Leftists have to be clear. Outsourcing our struggle to the state, which in Pakistan is in league with some very, very noxious political formation, feudal lords, and the party that governs Karachi, which is, I would argue, essentially a fascist party, the MQM. That will not advance secular, secular, tolerant, or women-friendly politics in the slightest. This is the same army, lest we forget, that is in the midst of brutally repressing a popular liberation struggle in the province of Balochistan. This is the 5th time that the army has been deployed. The most brutal was in 73 to 77, but now even there are reports, these are reports the Attorney General submitted to the Supreme Court, which say that about 1,600 Balochi activists have been disappeared from 2005 to present. The Balochi activists themselves put the number at 8,000, part of several thousands of people actually beyond Balochistan that have been gone missing since 9/11. There's an excellent documentary on the web actually about Pakistan's missing persons if you put it into Google.
What's the documentary?
It's called Pakistan's Missing Persons or something. You'll have to Google it. So honestly, I mean, the same military that has kept, and this is documented, has kept women as sex slaves in Balochistan and torture cells in Karachi becomes, for liberals and some leftists, an agent for the liberation of the Pakistani woman. Sometimes I think you can't even make this stuff up, and you see the same thing. You see the same thing in Afghanistan, as Derek will talk about. The third point: the vast majority of militants, in my opinion, who fight the Pakistani state have a litany of grievances that push them to violence and that push them to take up arms. So aside from the fact that many of these foot soldiers, I think, have picked up arms in response to extremely heavy-handed military operations, I didn't go through this, so there have been 3 military operations principally in the last 18 to 20 months in Pakistan. And together these have displaced about 2.7 million people. One of these offensives in the province of Bajour, the district of Bajour, displaced 300 to 400,000 people. The population of that district is 600,000. That's half of the population. So obviously some people have picked up arms in response to this kind of madness. Additionally, there's obviously, again, what I was talking about earlier, the direct effects of the Pakistani state and the spillover effects of the war in Afghanistan, which are all very serious. In addition, these insurgencies are, in some sense, overdetermined by things like endemic poverty. About 90% of households in FATA live on under $2 a day. Food insecurity. If you look at the 10 most food insecure districts in Pakistan, it reads like an insurgency hit list, basically. So all of these, so for example, North Waziristan is on this list, Mohmand Agency is on this list, South Waziristan is on this list, Orakzai is on this list, Bajour is on. These are all areas that have serious insurgencies, and they're all areas that are the most. These are all areas that are very afflicted by very serious food insecurity. Okay, I'm going to skip all this because I have 5 minutes. But if people are interested, I have some more statistics. We can come back to this question. So the last thing I wanted to say is a few points about the situation confronting progressives and the left in Pakistan. As in many other countries around the world, Pakistan's economy has been hit by a very serious crisis. At least 2 decades of privatizations as well have preceded this. About, I think the figure is like 160 odd privatizations since 1987. This has obviously compounded a legacy of underdevelopment from the colonial era. About 85% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. The food crisis has hit the peasantry and the working classes very severely. I have some actually data on this that, anyway, we can talk about that. The government is going to be paying back a massive IMF bailout package starting in 2011-2012, about $11 billion at 3 to 4% interest. In anticipation, austerity and retrenchment, high interest rates, and cut social welfare spending, they've all arrived. The federal cabinet only last month announced that it was slashing the social sector budget by 30%, shifting the money towards security expenditure, as is their want. Just this past Thursday, massive riots shut down parts of Rawalpindi following the announcement that there would be a hike in bus fares. This was eventually rescinded precisely because of the protests. And so much more of this kind of stuff awaits us, I think, including the high likelihood of another agreement with the IMF, precisely to rescue us from the debt that we incurred in the course of the previous one, familiar story. And I think that the task of resisting this is going to fall to progressives and to the left in Pakistan, the only force that has a substantive mass-based politics of resistance to neoliberalism. I think that, of course, it's in the grips of a serious crisis there and here and elsewhere, as we all know. Yet, and this is what I want to leave you with principally, the weakness of the left as an organized force does not mean that there is an absence of struggle in the country. Far from it. In a country as riven with contradictions as Pakistan, it could not but be this way. This is something that progressives and in general people in this country are not told enough. To make sense of Pakistan and to formulate a political strategy around the expansion of war into Pakistan, it is imperative that you abandon the imaginary of Islamophobia, the imaginary of the Islamophobes, where basically Pakistan is a country of 180 million people, all of them have beards and are veiled. The country, Pakistan also has workers and peasants. Pakistan also has class exploitation, and yes, sometimes even Pakistan has class struggle. There is a women's movement, a human rights movement, a labor movement, a peasants movement, a fisherfolk movement, a communist movement. Additionally, owing to the highly centralized and militarized character of our state, the national question is alive in almost every corner of the country. And I think this is perhaps the primary political fault line today. In every case, the national question is led by overwhelmingly secular forces in Sindh and Balochistan, even to some extent in NWFP, in the Northwest. There are a few anecdotes I have, but I can give these in the question and answer if people are interested. But so in closing, and this is something that I've said before and I want to say again, particularly as the United States mobilizes the tropes of a 21st century civilizing mission in AFPAC, that we're here to liberate their women, that we're here to quash the crazy Islamist that lives deep in all of their hearts, that we're here to save them from themselves, essentially, is the argument. We, the anti-war movement in the United States, the left in the United States, have to insist on one very simple premise. The people of the region have always been capable of, if not engaged in, emancipating themselves. Thanks.